Good evening. Welcome to the Enrollment and Facility Study Commission. This is meeting 1B, and we are still in the background stage of our work, and tonight promises to be full of good information for us to consider when we get to our discussions in January. Our agenda tonight is to introduce ourselves, and in a moment I will ask everyone to go around the table and give your name and your affiliation. We'll touch base briefly on the norms, review the objectives of the day, and then we have a number of follow-up items from our last meeting that the superintendent will walk us through. Have some follow-up items on the elementary capacity analysis. And then the bulk of the meeting will be on our secondary capacity analysis, which is, we're lucky to have the consultants here with us today, John Thomas, and he will be able to walk us through that material and also answer questions firsthand. So looking forward to that. Let's start with introductions, and we'll start at this end of the table this time.
Sure. Kevin Brewster, PEA and a Reiki teacher.
Jen Cooper, Bayside, BHP and EdTech representative.
Chris Dana, community member and Longfellow parent.
Sue Olafson, president of the Portland Teachers Union.
Tiana Uri, student rep.
David Brennerman, community member and retired city councilor.
Alicia Gardner, executive director of budget and finance for the school department.
Javier Botana, superintendent.
Peter Eglinton, community member.
Marnie Morioni, school board member, District 5.
Sarah Thompson, school board at large.
Mark Hubbard, admin assistant at King Middle School and representing the Base Union.
Caitlin LeClaire, principal at King Middle School, representing PAA.
Sheila Jepson, principal, Portland High School, representing Portland administrators.
Cheryl Crowley, resident of Cliff Island, parent of student in Casco Bay High School.
Great, thank you everybody. So as I mentioned at our very first meeting, we have a set of norms that we vetted with everyone, and I promise that we'll always have an opportunity to revisit them to see if they still work for us, and want to put it out there to see if anyone has any comments or suggestions regarding our norms. Seeing none, there's one comment that I have on one of the norms, and it's around the third bullet on welcoming and encouraging all input. And the only comment I have on that is, and it's been working pretty well so far, but I want to acknowledge that it's a pretty large group. I will try to sweep the table to look for folks that have their hands raised, and if you do, and I don't hit you the first time around, I will notice you and keep track and make sure that everyone has their chance to ask questions or give comments. So keep up the good work. Raise your hands, and I will do my best to find you. And if somebody on either side taps me on the shoulder to let me know that there's someone I'm missing, that's totally fine. So yes, Ms. Cook.
Thank you. Just a quick note that the door that I've always come in that has directed me as the main entrance is locked. It took some of us a little while to figure out another way into this meeting, and I'm concerned that members of the public may be having the same problem. And I don't know if there's a way to fix that or to put a sign up.
I wonder, Mr. Donaldson, yep, thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to take it as a sign to just turn around and go home and eat dinner with my family, but I knew that the rest of you had probably found a way into the building. And thankfully, Councilor Ali knew how to get in.
Thank you for your perseverance and for and for bringing it up. It's a relatively new stairwell, and although folks here are very excited about it, not everybody knows about it. So thank you. With that, we'll turn to our objectives for the day, and as I mentioned at the start, we're still in the background information phase of our work. We've gone through some of the baseline data on the district, and then we had a relatively deep dive on elementary schools at our last meeting, and today will be for secondary capacity and utilization. And so the next meeting that's coming up, I'll mention this again a bit later, we'll have a little bit more information building around projections, but then we will start getting into the work of looking at possible scenarios to have analyzed. So with that, I'd like to turn to the superintendent to walk through our follow-up requests and answers.
Yep. So these are the, today, sorry, good evening, everyone. And this meeting, we do not have the extensive list of follow-up items that we had at the previous meeting, so we're going to be able to dive right into the follow-up questions that anyone might have around the elementary enrollment analysis that we reviewed at the last meeting. John Thomas, who's with us tonight, wasn't here for that, so you indulged me in presenting that to you, but I know that there may be follow-up questions from that, and so this is an opportunity to ask Mr. Thomas any of those questions. The items that we had as follow-up, I know that one was getting meetings on the books, which we endeavored to do. So we have this meeting today is scheduled, and the meeting on January 14th, which, as Mr. Eglinton pointed out, is that will be the last of our sort of background building meetings, and really sort of transition us into the sort of what do we do with all of this information that we've been building, and that's scheduled for January 14th. Here at the same time, and at that time we will get the projection, the enrollment projections for the district, and the work that's been happening around that up until now. So that'll be reported out. So that was one of the items. I believe one of the members of the commission asked how we were dealing with the other buildings that the district owns that are not specifically elementary or secondary schools. So that would be things like our administration building, our Bayside building, our adult education building, as well as our support department, so the transportation office that you passed on your way in, as well as our food service facility. And so we have not included them in the capacity analysis as, as specific items that are being looked at for capacity, because I think our assumption from the very beginning is that to the extent that there is additional space in schools, that we would look for our ability to move those buildings off of our roles and move some of those operations into schools. Now, there's no realistic way to do that with transportation or with our food service operation, but as far as the administration office or the Portland Adult Ed, which, as most of you know, is currently in a leased facility that belongs to the Archdiocese, if there is a way as a result of this process to bring those structures into one of our existing school buildings, we obviously will be looking at that as part of our, sort of the conceptual the conceptual design, sort of the next phase of the work. So that's true for Portland Adult Ed. Their lease is up this year, and we are holding off on signing a new lease until we know if there is going to be an opportunity to do something on that front through this work. So that's true for them. It's obviously true also for the administration building. The Board of Education is well aware of the commitment that we've made to Bayside to relocate away from their current location in the basement of the administration building. So that is something that there has been a task force. That task force has made recommendations for how we are looking to build a continuum of educational opportunities for our children with emotional disabilities. So we will be bringing that. We are scheduled to bring that to the board on January 18th. So their second board meeting of January with specific recommendations for how to do that for next year. So that has, budget implications because it's not just the relocation of that building, but it's also the establishment of a continuum of behavioral supports throughout the school district. And so that's a fairly significant, but, work that has been happening parallel to this, and that's preceded this by, close to a year. So we are fully expecting that Bayside will not be in its current location, and instead will be occupying a variety of spaces throughout the school district next year. So that's how we're dealing with sort of the buildings that are not included in the capacity analysis on the elementary side or on the secondary side, which is what we're going to be doing today. I mentioned last week at our last meeting when we talked about the sort of the considerations that came from the public, that we had specifically asked the Island Institute to draft what they believed were significant considerations for the commission to take into account as we moved forward with this work. So in your packet and on your desk is that set of considerations from the Island Institute. So this is, we asked them specifically what are the things that we should be thinking about beyond the fact, as you saw when we did the elementary capacity analysis, that those buildings are physically underutilized, but there are additional considerations when dealing with Island schools. And so we asked them to provide sort of an in-depth look at what those considerations would be, and so that is a part of your packet. So I also just want to point out that we made a commitment to do the quantitative analysis of the survey feedback to sort of provide some descriptive analysis of what, how many people said what, and so we are working on that and expect to have that for the meeting on the 14th. So that's it in terms of the follow-up items from the last meeting. So we're going to shift, as I would love if you have any questions that you ask them now. If I left anything out, that you let me know. And then the last sort of follow-up is, are there any questions about the elementary capacity, at which point I would turn that over to John to help answer any questions. So any questions about these 4 items before we move into the elementary follow-up?
Ms. Morioni?
Thank you, Chair Eglinton. My question is regarding the Bayside decision. And how will that be factored in if we are moving students into various schools? Will that be part of the capacity analysis, or will it be, you said it's running parallel, but how will it?
Yeah, we will know that this is the proposal is for, for Bayside Elementary to be, so portions of it to be at, at Rose School, for example. And so that will then be factored into the capacity availability at Rowe or at any other facility.
When the time comes to know. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Ms. Cook.
Thank you. And I apologize because I did not get all the way through the packet to look at the Island Institute information, but did they discuss, as I understand, we have one island, full-time island, where we do not have an elementary school, but we have an agreement with another district to provide schooling. And so I'm just curious, whether the Island Institute information, when I do get a chance to go back and look at it, will tell me about the benefits of a school on an island versus consolidating island schools as we have, at least I think for Great Diamond Island. So anyway.
So if you look at that, it's a single-page handout. Number 2 on the back, in terms of considerations, would take a position that that's not a good model. But that is for your consideration, obviously.
I was less, okay, So
it specifically says going to the next island over is not an option.
okay. And is that because it's not working well for Great Diamond Island?
I don't feel like that I can speak for the Island Institute, so.
No, but for our schools. So we do that already. And so I just think we should be considering, certainly, if we're looking at enrollment in facilities, right? If it doesn't work for Peaks and it doesn't work for Cliff, why does it work for Great Diamond? And if it doesn't work for Great Diamond, should we be looking at that as well?
So I think that to contextualize that situation, and some of this predates my tenure, there has not been a school on Great Diamond for quite some time because there were no children, so there was no need for a school. Over the last couple of years, there have been 3 children, I believe maybe 4 now, that have moved onto the island or were, born to residents on the island. And so our solution to date has worked for those families. So we don't have at this point, anybody coming and saying, you should set up a school on Great Diamond. And, that's not to say that it won't happen at some point, but it hasn't. But, I would say that in the evolution of this situation, that we are at the very infancy of the resurgence of Great Diamond as a place with a year-round colony. So I don't know that I can say that it's working, and it's not like we've been doing it for 25 years and people love it. We've been doing it for the last couple of years, and I don't know, Cheryl, you probably, and Kelly, you both probably have more insight into this than I do.
Has it been 2 years?
And Kelly, I think that might be unfair because you probably have about as much context as I do.
I think this is only year 2, so I don't think that's there's information to say whether it's successful or not. But there hasn't been a school there already established, fighting for their existence.
Gotcha.
So they came up with a solution so those families could stay there, and that was the current solution.
And it's an agreement with Long Island.
It's an agreement with Long Island,
And they now
to
have
date,
more children than Cliff.
Yes.
Okay.
yeah. And to date, it's worked for those families, but I don't know that it would continue to work into the, into the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Ms. Morioni?
Sticking with the island theme just for a second, in the 2-pager from the Island Institute, it talks about sending young children to an additional one of the islands would create other expenses, such as hiring staff to supervise students. Could we get, and also paying tuition, incurring travel? I would just love to know more of a breakdown of those costs, just so we can look at the cost of maintaining this existing school versus paying for some of the needs that it would take.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, seeing no further questions, go on to the next topic.
So again, I would just open it up to any follow-up questions about the elementary capacity presentation that we had at the last meeting. And if there are any follow-up questions that you would like John to address.
don't appear to be any further questions.
That's because I either did such a great job of presenting it, or you've all decided that it was so forgettable that you had no questions.
So does that mean we're at the secondary capacity analysis? Oh, yes, Mr. Brenneman.
If you have a consultant here, I might as well ask a question. So with all of the data that you presented, superintendent presented for you, what conclusions should this commission reach from, probably ask the same question about the secondary as well. Yeah. Because it's not the easiest stuff to understand. So what conclusion should we reach based on what you've presented as far as whether schools have reached capacity or close to capacity, and what does that mean, and how do we proceed with that?
Good question. So first of all, good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me. I would say my biggest takeaway from the elementaries is that, and I'll preface this by saying there's always room for improvement in making a school operate better and making the spaces run more consistently. I think consistency is a big thing, and if you looked at the way I designed the little spreadsheets that were in the study with the little breakdown of the design at the bottom, it's all about creating this sustainable size of the various grade levels that lets everything run through consistently and stay sustainable. But I guess my big takeaway is it looks like you're running pretty nicely now, and if it isn't broken, I wouldn't try to fix it. I would try to make some small improvements in places. Now, that could change a little bit when I see what comes from Davis, because they're going to be running the numbers on each different enrollment zone around around each school. And what I like to do is look at the enrollment zones and look for a complementary arrangement where we might have one school's enrollment zone or two schools beside each other, that one is slightly overloaded and the other one's slightly underloaded. And moving the line a little bit might mutually benefit those two schools. But I think that your elementary schools are really running pretty close to where I would design them to run, with some small exceptions. I think that's the big thing. So we're going to come up with some options for how you can improve the elementary schools, and we'll start talking conceptually about those on the 14th. I would just say don't expect anything really big and dramatic, because I think you're pretty good right now. That's my big takeaway. There's probably some smaller ones that I've written into the report, but you're pretty well balanced.
Okay. Ms. Morioni?
Thank you for being here tonight. So from what we understood is that the pre-K information, the pre-K data came a little bit later and was added as an appendix. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because it sounded as if that was a factor that needed further research, further analysis. So can you talk about where you are with that information?
Actually, we had the analysis done.
Okay.
And while I had utmost faith in Javier to present it to the best of his ability, I kind of felt like we were overloading him with a really tricky little discussion on the pre-K. So we ran two completely different analyses. We ran one with the pre-K and one without. And the reason that I wanted to run it with the two ways is because the pre-K does not fit, I'll use the word rhythmically, into the rest of the operation. That you have your K through 5 running at hopefully close to even rounds, that they're running at the same number of sections per grade level. So when we put pre-K up against those other consistent capacity grade levels, or what we think can be consistent capacity grade levels, it just sticks out. It doesn't run smoothly because it's not going to be loaded at the same rate as K. So I just kind of felt like it made it more confusing. So what we're proposing to do, and I actually have another presentation that we can run through that, and I can demonstrate why I'm keeping it separately. But I think the best way to handle it is to acknowledge that the pre-K is there and that you're looking to expand it, and that when we look at different alternatives for how you use your buildings, that we show how the best way to work the pre-K in at each facility. Because right now, it's like, I like to see it, is it a 3-round, 4-round, 5-round? And again, the concept of that is come up with a number of sections per grade level that fits the enrollment zone and that is manageable. So there's going to be slight variations every year. And I'm a big proponent of the more sections per grade level you can get, the better, because you're dividing by a bigger number and it lets you even out the class size better. It makes it more consistent. So when you have the pre-K in the mix, it kind of flies in the face of that. But I'm aware that you want it and that it's growing in popularity and you want to accommodate it with more spaces, but I just think it's not in the same discussion as the K through 5.
No, that's completely understandable. And when you say we want it, it's also a matter of how we're funding it and how we're going to be moving it forward in the next few years. So I appreciate that understanding. Thank you.
Anybody else?
No further questions. So now we can turn to the secondary capacity analysis, and this will keep John Thomas going.
While John is setting up, I think I probably have not done good service to John in the introduction. John Thomas is a principal for Thomas & Williamson. Thomas & Williamson is a firm out of Pennsylvania, out of Pittsburgh, that he is obviously one of the named principals of, that does this type of work across the country. They are a subcontractor to Davis Demographics for this particular aspect of the work, where Davis Demographics is a demographics firm, so they have the primary responsibility for the boundary setting, for the redrawing of boundaries, for the enrollment projections and the demographic projections. John and his team specialize in the actual capacity analysis and the reconfiguration of structures. So that's why John is here. At the January 14th meeting, we will have somebody from Davis Demographics that has been doing the enrollment projections, and John will probably also be here because we will begin the conceptual options, but I think it would probably help everybody to contextualize John, Thomas, and Williamson in the context of Davis Demographics, which is the way that we have talked about this, the consulting work. So, John, anything else we ought to know about your history? Let me just
say, our firm has worked with Davis for several years. I think usually we're the prime because it's just the way it works out. And I developed a relationship with Davis several years ago. I found myself needing a really solid technology-based demographer. I don't know if you guys have worked with demographers before. We seem to find most of them are very clinical and will give you a lot of anecdotal information, but they're not really good at connecting the dots. So I found Davis, and we've had a great relationship. They are fantastic dot connectors. That they do their process through geocoding all the students in your school district. So when we run into a situation like I was just talking about, the potential complementary nature of one enrollment zone versus another that might be beside it, and I say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could move this line just a little bit, and they can move that line in their computer and not have to go through a clinical analysis to figure out, well, what the impact will be. So it's great for this conceptual modeling that we're going to go through to come up with workable solutions that are backed up by data. I got into the business back in the early 90s as a management consultant that did a lot of work with K-12 school districts. I'm an engineer by training, started out actually in architecture, and migrated more toward the planning and development side of building projects. So one of my first clients that I had, corporate clients, Bell Telephone back then and AT&T, they were always spending a lot of money on their facilities because they were getting rid of a bunch of phone switching equipment in their buildings, filling them up with computers and people. So they had a huge planning operation that they took in the mid-'80s following the divestiture of Bell Telephone and AT&T. So I got a crash course in how to plan buildings and how to figure out what spatial needs were. And I took that knowledge and technology that I had developed and moved it into the K-12 market because it was kind of in the same need. It was more of a moving target. They needed to find ways on a regular basis of keeping their operations solid. And I do a lot of other types of management consulting that has to do with making counts like these, building related. I do a lot of forensic work for law firms where there's a loss of productivity related to construction or delays, and I have to work the time element into the operation. So it's not uncommon that I'm giving testimony somewhere. So I'm very comfortable. If you guys have questions, if you wanna ask them in an attorney-like manner, or if you wanna have casual banter, we can do it either way. So let's, without further ado, let's move through this. So on the first, as you saw last time, we put a glossary of terms that we were using. Some of them are my jargon. Some of them are terms that are prevalent in the planning industry. There was just a couple that I wanted to get to before we get into this, and it was something that I made the mistake of not briefing the principals on this technique before I met with them, and they looked at me like I was a little crazy. And then as soon as they figured out what I was up to, I think it helped them crystallize where I was going. But this concept of FTE, you talked about it last time, full-time equivalent, and it's a capacity metric. And what we're doing here, for the most part, we're giving an equivalent capacity to each room. And we're saying 25 for a lecture space, and we're dropping that down to 20 students per period in a hands-on space. There's some oddballs in there. If you have a large group room, you might have 2 sections in there. I think we have an LGI that we're running at 50. And then we have the gymnasium that we run at 33 students per teaching station. That's a very old measurement that was used, and it has something to do with the rotation of classes with 4 at 25, and then taking 2/3 of that to get you to the 66 in a gym, and it balanced out for planners many years ago, and it's just kind of stuck that you do 33, and it does work out. the adjusted FTE. Now, this is going to be vastly different than what you looked at for the elementary schools, because in the elementary schools, you're just moving a group of kids around the school. In the secondary schools, and primarily at the high school level, you introduce the element of chaos into your operation, because you can send the students out to individual classes and they break from the group. Everybody clear on that? That we're at the high school, it might be happenstance that somehow a group forms and a lot of kids are in the same class, but that's not the intent. They are really more subject-centered, as we say, in their approach to their destinations per period. So to account for that, we factor the FTE down. We take it 10% lower than operating at a consistent 20 or 25 for the most part. And I think we had this discussion with Sue Ellen yesterday. Sue Ellen said, I've got this one room that we really have to pack the kids in there. I says, well, one of the things to consider, Sue Ellen, is we are factoring down the 20 and 25. And when you have multiple rooms, it does build up a surplus capacity. And when you really don't want to look at any one room just unto itself. You want to look at it in the whole context of the school that you're in. But that's where the safety in numbers kind of averages things out for you. But we are not pretending that we can ever run a school at 100%. So it gets factored down automatically by that 0.9. That's the best that you'll do. The best that you'll do is that 0.9. That becomes the measuring stick. So that when we start talking about the percent of utilization, it's against the 90, because you're never going to get better than the 90. A couple other things. The spaces that we're looking at are the scheduled spaces, the ones that appear in the master schedule for the school. They have the student counts in them, where each student is supposed to, what room they're supposed to be in every period. Let's compare and contrast that with a non-scheduled space. Non-scheduled spaces have to be there too. You can't have a school operating well without having additional rooms in your school that are left empty. They have to be empty to be able to handle the ebb and flow of resource education. Let me give you a for instance. Most schools have a library. The library might have a class in it, but it would not be scheduled. A resource special ed space, a space that doesn't have kids assigned to it, but you could break out and do learning support in that space, would be another example of a non-scheduled space. So you're not getting capacity for it, and by the same token, we're not counting it against the capacity of the school. We're putting it below the line just so that you understand that we see that it's there, and that we're not going to penalize the operation of the percent utilization of the school by putting in a non-scheduled space that is only going to be running at a very small student count per period. I think that's all I really needed to hit on here, but if there's any questions about a term that I use as we go through the presentation, please feel free to jump in and I'll take care of that for you. So much like what we had on the elementary schools, subtle difference on this one. So it's taking the gross middle school capacity, and of course you have some district-wide programs. They have to be factored in at the top level of the analysis, because if you had a space that is coming from all over the district and it's taking capacity away from the school, we need to understand what the max capacity is. So just listening to what you guys were talking about with bringing in some of your other potential non-education operations, their education in the broad sense, but not in the student sense. If there's a desire to, for instance, take the transportation office and move it into one of the spaces in one of the schools that we see that is underloaded, we would treat that the same way as the district-wide special program capacity. It's displacing space on the top level of the analysis. So we have that same relationship with, we're looking at the middle school capacity across the board, looking at the high school capacity across the board, subtracting out the capacities that are being taken up by your district-wide programs. Where do they reside? So in this one, you kind of have all of the above. You have the special district-wide programs at one school. You have ELL at King. You have Baxter at Moore. You have life skills at Moore. You have life skills at Deering. You have life skill. You have Baxter at Portland. So that's those are instances of where you have those programs at one of the schools. Secondly, at several schools, we have the self-contained FA at King and Lincoln, and at the high school level we also have it at Deering and Portland. At a dedicated facility, yes, you have that as well. You have your emotional support related education going on at Bayside. Not a large amount of that, but worth noting. And then finally, outside the district facilities, you have your part-time VOTAC. So you have students that are participating, 144 district-wide, 144 students that spend half their day at your high schools that you run yourself, and then the other half of the day that you run the consortium. And then here's a listing of those programs. So when we come down to the overall, we have the gross middle school capacity minus the district-wide programs, giving us the net middle school capacity. Same thing with the high schools, except when we get down to the last line, we're actually adding in capacity because it's capacity that's happening outside your system, outside your primary system. Now let's move on. This chart should look a little familiar because we did the same thing for the elementary schools. More colors on this one because we have more departments. And let me say a word about departments. Why we like to arrange these in departments, even in the case where if you talked with Caitlin as an example, she'd say, I don't really run departments. I run houses. But there's an overlap. There's a science department or grouping, and of course science is included in each one of the houses and teams. So we like to arrange the common rooms together, primarily because when you start analyzing alternatives, you have to know that you're satisfying each corner of your curriculum. So we like to keep those off to the side. And then also, there's always the potential of having these spaces with unique spatial qualities. And I know we talked about that a little bit in the elementary. So let's just take one of the easiest ones. Let's take a science lab. That a science lab doesn't really look like a science lecture classroom. So if you looked at an alternative, you would really want to know if you had rooms that were capable of supporting that kind of instruction. So parsing these out into departments and noting that you have unique spatial qualities is also part of the reason for having the departments. And again, like I said, the range of the spectrum here is wider than what we this is another concept I wanted to run through with you because this is different than what you have at the elementary level. So you have to look at the configuration as well. So the top one would, with the 6 blocks arranged, would be something, would be an arrangement that you'd be looking for in a high school, where the students have, from their perspective, autonomous schedules, and you'd see the department pretty much grouped with the adjacency. On the contrary, and this is true for each one of your middle schools, that your students are really grouped in sections and teams, and the sections move from subject to subject. And I have an illustration of that. So, and again, not everybody on the panel is an educator. So I'm not going to assume that you all know this. I'm not an educator either, and this was one of the things that I had to learn along the way. So again, the essence of this concept is you're doing the middle school concept to foster this community relationship. And some people go to different lengths with it. Some districts go to different lengths with it than others. But it's trying to create a bridge from the experience that the students are having at the elementary level to what they're going to have at the high school level, and make it a nicer transition for them. And the educators, they interlace these advisory and supported study periods along with the academic process. So the students are grouped within their section, just like they were in elementary school. The student sections are grouped within a house, so this would be one house here. And then the houses are grouped within a grade level. And in your case, consistently throughout each middle school, there are 2 houses per grade level. Good idea. Thanks. So the way this works then is we have we have 4 sections that are going on in each house, and they are moving within the rooms of the house. And then let's bring this in. So I'll note that it's not exactly the same everywhere, that there's some departures that are being taken with, I think it's fair to say that Lincoln is the most pure house concept. And then Caitlin and Ben they each do something a little bit different that kind of works in their own individual flavor of their school. For the most part, though, the core stays the same. So let's look at what happens at Lincoln. So Lincoln is I would call it the most traditional house model. So we have the 2 maths, 2 sciences, 2 languages, 2 social studies in the core, and they form 2 houses. That happens at each grade level. I put a little note down on the right corner to distinguish that. Then King, we do something a little bit different. Caitlin brings in more, I'm sorry, I don't want to say more because more is a school also, additional classes into her core. And then she alternates the music, and this is as an example for 6th grade. She alternates that from over a half-year cycle. And then Ben, he does something even a little bit different. So he kind of does the same thing as Caitlin's doing. And in addition, he has this, this group of electives that he works into his related arts program. So instead of just having a static list of related arts, he has a more refined list of other arts electives that when you get into 8th grade, it's almost like he's running a junior high for 8th grade. So the core stays the same, but the related arts changes a little bit. Now let's talk about our process for going through this. And this is much different than the process that we used for the elementary schools. So we were given the tables from each school of their classroom usage. So we were looking for what room number, what teacher was in that room, what the primary use of the room was, and let me just say, when you go through the final book, you're going to see some anomalies in there, and that's all they are. It's to be expected that sometimes the principals will put a different kind of class in what I view as like the math department. So if you go to Casco Bay, there's a Mandarin Chinese class taking place in a math room. But that's what that is. It is a math room because every other period is math. And it just so happens that the room was open for that period and the Mandarin Chinese teacher moved in to use the room. It doesn't make it a math / Chinese classroom. So we're getting all the data for, and this comes out of the principal's master schedules. What room, what period, how many kids, what class, what course, and then of course what department it fits into. So then we go through and we, just like what we did with the elementary schools, we key the floor plan. And we look at where those classes are, as there's some adjacency there. And I'll scroll through some of those and show you how some of your schools, they look like they're a very deliberate reflection of the program, and other ones not so close. So mark up the keyed floor plan just like we did with the elementaries with the use and that color coding. And then of course analyzing the classroom schedule and compiling all of that information so that we can figure out not just the overall loading that's going on in the school, but what's happening with the time element that's coming out. How much of a concentration of time is being used in each room? And let me just segue out of that for a second and explain that most people who plan educational facilities, they are the ones who are designing them. So they're really more intent on getting the right qualities of spaces in, and they don't generally analyze how often that room is being used and what concentration of students are going through it. Most of them do a more bottom line analysis, and I've included a bottom line analysis in along with the concentration analysis on the summary pages, and I'll walk you through that. But I think it's important to keep it in your mind that you could have a school that's designed to hold the total amount of students that you're putting through it, and it might run very well for one period. But as soon as you start changing the concentrations around, and you have a heavier loading during some periods of the day, you have to make sure that it works every period of the day. And that's why we're getting down in the weeds with looking at what the loading is in a course and in a department, in a room all day long. So here's the process. First we look at the gross capacity. And we categorize each space in the school as scheduled or non-scheduled. If it's non-scheduled, we move it into another category. We label each space with its appropriate FTE capacity. We tabulate the spaces and their FTEs and apply the adjustment factor that we discussed earlier. And then we sort each scheduled space on the master schedule by room number. And for part B, the loading efficiency, sort each scheduled space on the master schedule by room number, segregate the total number of students per period in each space per subject for one day of the week of one term. Now, let me just say this, and this is something we were experimenting with. You have white days and you have blue days. And this was one where Sheila was particularly helpful. Maybe Sheila's the best at running the software. I'm not sure. She certainly was that day. So Sheila was able to go into her schedule and sort the report that was provided to us by blue days and white days. We were able then to segregate that in the total into a blue analysis and a white analysis. You would expect that they would be the same, and they pretty much are. There's not a lot of difference. So it's good to look at. It's good to look at. Keep it consistent. Look at one day of the week. You have to know that there's some interlacing going on, switching on a 10-day rotation, blue and white days. And then we always advocate spot checking, and we've spot checked a couple things, and everything looks consistent to us. List all subjects delivered in the spaces. You'll see that in one of our reports, and then calculate the total student periods per room. You guys, I assume you guys talked about student periods last time. It's a little bit more intense here. A student period is it's a compound quantity with a student for a period. And that's the basis of this whole analysis. Then down at the bottom, you can see how we arrive at that. It's the actual scheduled student periods divided by the adjusted FTE times the periods available gives us the utilization rate in each room. That's the most confusing part of the whole thing. So then, for each school, calculate the loading efficiency, give you the subtotal by department for the scheduled spaces, noting that you have non-scheduled spaces, you have to have them, we're keeping them off to the side. And then subtotals of each department and give you the grand total for the scheduled spaces. And then, of course, sum the subtotals by department for the non-scheduled spaces as well, so you can see that we're recognizing that you have rooms that you have to run at a very low capacity because of the specific needs of the kids that are in there. So here's what this looks like. This would be, each report has for each report for each department, at the top of the page has the spaces, and here we picked the one with the Mandarin Chinese. So this is primarily math, and you can see there's a little bit of other things in there. So we're listing the courses. We are listing the rooms available and the capacity of that room. So the 135 is simply the 25 per section times 0.9 times the number of periods per day that room would be available. And it gives you the capacity for each room. And then the analysis looks something like this. So it's showing you for each class that's conducted in that room what its instantaneous utilization rate is. Those are summed up per day to give you the amount of loading that takes place in each room per day. Any questions on that one?
Mr. Brewster?
In the elementary study, we were shooting for 85. Is 85% capacity? Is that the standard for the middle school as well?
Shooting higher. I'm shooting higher for the high schools, and let me just say this before we even get into looking at the numbers for the middle schools. When a school district makes the decision to go with the middle school program, they at the same time are making the decision to not have great utilization rates. And the reason for that is when you look at the elementary school where you're basically trying to fill one egg crate with 25 or 22 to 25 eggs at the elementary level. Now you're looking at running 4 of those. So you have to run the house. You can't drop the house down to 3. You're keeping 4. And since you have 2 of those per grade level, now you're looking at a situation where you've got a school that runs with its great organization and social integration. It runs with that minimum denominator of 8. So let's say you have a school where let's just use one house. So let's say we have a house made up of 4 sections, and the target section size would be 25. And of course, we're going to factor that down. And then we find ourselves in one year where we only have 80 kids. Well, now you're down to 20 per section because you're going to divide by 4. If you didn't have that kind of configuration, most people would divide by 3. That they'd have the 80 kids divided by 3, and it would still fit in with their class loading guidelines. You can't do that when you have the house configuration. Everybody clear on that one? So there's a built-in inefficiency that comes with any middle school. And I'm not surprised at the utilization rates of your middle schools. You're where everybody else's middle schools are. Sometimes we run into this a lot, where we have a former junior high school that got turned into a middle school. It had all the right parts in it. It had home ec, wood shop, art, choral, band. It had sometimes an auditorium. It had all the right parts to run a middle school program in it. Or I'm sorry, a junior high school program in it. And then somebody looked at it and said, oh, that can be a middle school. Some people just changed the name, you know. They changed it from Portland Junior High to Portland Middle School. And they kind of convince themselves that they're really running a middle school. They are not running a middle school the way you guys are. You guys are doing it the real way. But some of these other people, they have the converted junior high school, and they put everybody into a regular purpose classroom in homeroom period. The homeroom bell rings, and the capacity of the school expands by about 40%, because they had the gymnasium, the food lab, the art room as a non-homeroom space. There were no kids in there for homeroom. They were in a regular purpose classroom. And then as soon as the kids went on their way through their day into the school, it just grows immensely. You don't have that because you have your house structure, and I think you got an example with King, where even some of the related arts are meshed into the core subjects. But in your case, the thing that really puts the limit on your efficiency is that group of 8. And I'll show you a slide later on to give you an illustration of how that works against you. Did I answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
For now.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I promise we'll go through the illustration later, and I think it'll make more sense to you. But the short answer is, your middle schools aren't going to run at a great utilization rate. But since you've decided you want a middle school, that's what you've bargained for.
Mr. Dana?
Is the methodology that you've used in these studies substantially similar to what other consultants who operate in this area use, or is it something?
That's why I'm using it.
Okay.
I'm using. We probably could have got into, and in some cases we did do a little bit of a custom analysis. But I find it best to use something that's widely adopted. This is something that there was a group that I used to belong to called the Council of Educational Facilities Planners International, CEFP, and they published a number of manuals for how you would do this. And I just think it's best to stay as close to that as you can so you can measure yourself against your peers. And I'll be the first one to say that I understand that comparisons are odious, that you can't compare one thing to another thing without upsetting somebody. And even though I know the comparisons are odious, I've made comparisons in this study, and hopefully people won't get too upset with my comparisons.
Mr. Brenneman.
Yes, sir.
So how do we know what the optimal utilization should be, optimal efficiency? If one school is 33% and another school is 41%, how do we know if both of those make sense? Or are the schools underutilized, overutilized?
Yeah, we'll get into that. Well, I'll have that later on in the show, and I'll show you that when I make my odious comparison, I'll show you that some are running at a higher efficiency than others, and I'll tell you why. But I'll tell you on that slide. But I would say if you're anywhere between 50 and 60% on a middle school, kind of par for the course.
And high school?
High school, I like to see them up around 90. I like to see them, which, if you think about it, is really 80 because I've spotted everybody 10% already in the adjusted FTE.
Okay, so you'll get to, if a high school is in the 50s or 60s, what does that mean?
You're empty.
So there's capacity to put something else there?
That's correct.
Okay.
Anybody else on this one? I'll be rehashing this a little bit more as we go in. I'm trying to lay the groundwork for you. So let's go to, here's Lincoln. So at Lincoln, it's really important to note when you look at this chart, the ones that I'm really focusing on are the language arts, there we go, language arts, the math, the science, and the social studies. And they're the ones that are carrying these big available capacities. They should really be all the same. You're running something a little bit different at your science department. We're not going to look into the details tonight. You'll be getting a book like this that has all the details, and you can research them at your leisure. But let me just say that the reason you have that there is there's a math lab I'm sorry, that's the sustainable science, I think, that's mixed in there. So it takes that capacity up a little bit. But I think looking at those one is a good barometer to see how you're doing in the facility. So we look at the top part of the chart, this up here, up above the line, and we are running at 62%, almost 63% for the scheduled classes. So the classes that are scheduled on your master schedule, they are at 63% of what they could be. And then you can see the capacities of the ones that I'm not counting against you down below. The academic support department, it includes classes such as enrichment, the learning lab, there's a math, language, social studies, and science special ed in there as well. And then, of course, I'm sure multilingual and the ELL is pretty familiar to everybody up here. Just looking at the footprint, this school was designed, I think, as a house configuration. So you can see this is a house down here, and it has one of each of the core in it, and it's kind of a nice feature. It even has some special ed space in it with it as well. I call that 8A, so that's grade 8. That's half of the grade level there. Go to the next floor. We have a house for 7th grade over here. I call that 7A, and 7th grade over here, 7B. So you can see that the concept of this is that the kids enter their house and they stay within that house as they go through their program, and that's the contribution. That's the value contribution that you get by having the house configuration like this. Of course, is the social interaction with a smaller group of the student body than the whole student body. And then on to the next one. This is the second floor plan, the 3rd level. We have 6th grade in this house and in this house over here as well, 6A and 6B. And then finally, up on the 3rd floor, the 4th level, you have 8th grade in this house, and then you have your related arts over on this side. So the name of the game is to try to arrange your building such that you have your related arts accessible in a common area, not a house area. So some of the buildings accomplish this very well. Other ones, looks like they might have had some junior high flavor to them. But something to keep in mind, that when I talked earlier about the department structure, for the middle schools, if you're staying with the middle school concept, it's best to have a configuration that is kind of a physical reflection of how the program works. So this is more, and you can see we have the same kinds of differences here. So in the language arts, in addition to to just the core functions there, you also have a literacy lab in there, and then in the math you have a math lab in there. So the basic core size is the 1080, and of course we're measuring the efficiencies for each one of the departments, summing them up. This one's at 40.17%. Something I wanted to note. We have this gray area here on this page that says unscheduled rooms. They are really white on the schedule where we have an unscheduled room. So they're left uncolored. And of course, you get the same battery of the special ed spaces down below that we don't expect to run at high rates. And then, of course, we have this. I think this one you just saw on the previous slides. You just saw how you had this physical manifestation of the house concept in the floor plan. You don't have that here. This one it's kind of broken up. You have more of a departmentalized configuration in the back. It's hard to tell where the house boundaries are for 7A and 7B, but they're both in there. And then you have 6th grade kind of running the same way up in here. It's not a clean house. It's kind of spread apart. So it on paper, on a schedule, it's designed to function the same way as the house, but the physical boundaries aren't so pronounced as they are in the other two. Another 6th grade over here. And then you have your 8A and B up on the 2nd floor. And again, all the color coding it's showing you where the rooms are of what type. So let's move on to King. And we have King at almost 51%. The scheduled spaces are running at 51%. And then, of course, you have your academic support spaces. We're not penalizing the operation because you have to have one of those in there. And by the way, while I'm mentioning that, I don't know if the issue of paths is coming up in terms of the capacity for paths. It's when we get into a specialized curriculum like you have at a VOTEC, it's almost nothing about capacity. It's about what kind of program you're offering. So you might be offering something like auto tech, that you've decided you're going to offer the auto tech program. And I assume that Portland has a seat on the paths board, or they have some kind of input. If you decide you're going to have an auto tech program, that doesn't necessarily guarantee you that you're going to have a lot of attendance in it, but you have the program. And sometimes you find that some programs just get flooded with participation. Like we see in just about every VOTEC we look at, we see that there's a huge amount of kids participating in the healthcare careers at the VOTECs. And it's whenever we study what the participation is likely to be in the future, we always find that that's the one that's growing the most. So it's a situation where you've decided that you want to have that program, but it's completely capacity independent. It's you're having that program first, and you hope that you get the capacity or you get participation in it, but it's really reversed from what we're doing here. And there's a corollary with the special ed. So the special ed, you have to have that programming, and it's not dependent on how well you're filling up that program. If you have a school and you've got kids with special needs, they have to have that programming, and capacity is not a big deal. It's that you're addressing the educational quality in that space. So here we have the sixth grade back in this group. So we're kind of getting back to the house concept, a little bit more of a closer relationship. We have the seventh grade over in this corner, and we have 8A, I called it, in here. So it's not as deliberately laid out as Lincoln was, but it's a lot closer than Moore. And I think Caitlin was telling me that she doesn't have the cleanest separation for the related arts in there, but she's found creative ways of configuring the houses around those so that you don't have to cross over one house to get into the other. So while it's not a winged configuration for the related arts, it's pretty close given the challenges that you have in the building, layout-wise. And then we have 7, I called it 7B back on this side, 6B over here, 8B over here in this wing. All right, let's get back to your big question. Let me take a quick sip here. Okay, so here's the comparison. You have one school that's really lower than I would like to see, and that would be Moore. So Moore is running at approximately 40% in the functional parts of the school, the scheduled parts of the school. So why is that happening? It's really you have the same model that you're running in every school, right? It's simply a function of the enrollment that you're putting in. If it's not that, and I think Ben's a pretty creative guy. He came up with a neat way of working in the elective style of related arts, but that's not what the way that the principals are designing their program, the way they're running their school. It is not what is driving these numbers. You just don't have as many kids going into Moore as you have going into the others. I think there's a, and we'll show this later, you have the same thing with Casco Bay. Casco Bay looks like it's running at this really amazing overall utilization rate. The reality is, they're just packed in there. There's a lot of participation coming to that school for its size. So if you could find a way to, let's say, we get into into discussing the alternative reconfigurations for your school district. You said, hey, John, we really like the middle school the way it is. We want to keep it just the way it is. We want to keep Moore, King, and Lincoln. And we want to keep the configuration inside each one of those schools exactly the way it's running now. What do? Well, you move the lines, and you find a way of balancing that out more if you're hung up on it. The fact that on the whole you're running at 50% in your scheduled areas, I'm okay with it. You could go higher, not much higher. You can see that you have Lincoln up at 62, again, as primarily a function of how many kids are getting sent into Lincoln. That's the only thing that's making it run at the higher percentage. Everybody with me on this one? That it's not some bad management practice that's going on. It's not the design of the operation of the school. To me, it's simply how many kids you're putting into it. And I think you have 3 data points here that you can fall back on to see that. I'll have another analysis for you in my conclusion. Any other questions on? Did I get to your question right there on that one?
Mine?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't answer the question yet about, are there other configurations that would work? We're about to spend money to fix Lyseth School. Maybe there should be a K-8 school built on that property. I don't know, but, and I don't know if that's cheaper or more expensive to do that, but.
Good point. And actually, thanks for mentioning that, because I haven't said this enough, and I guarantee you I didn't say it enough when I met with the principals either. The part of the process that we're in right now is to set the baseline, to make sure we understand our baseline operation. How are we operating right now? Looking at it in the most fair way, so that when we start looking at alternatives, that we have something to measure against. Are we going to improve upon the baseline when we go into the next round? So you're one meeting ahead of me.
Ms. Olson?
But I appreciate the commentary.
It may be that your first suggestion, that if you just move the lines, which people hate too, but I mean, that may solve the problem of evening out the number of kids in each school, if that needs to be done. I don't know.
If you move the lines, you're going to be at 50.5% on that bottom line.
Oh,
you're going to stay there.
Oh, okay.
All you're going to do is redistribute for whatever reason to try to make those individual line items on those schools that are listed there on the rows, to make them look more consistent. When you're all said and done, you're going to be back to 50.5%.
Okay.
Does everybody understand why I'm saying that?
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Olson?
So I just have a question about the varying information that we've gotten. So this particular chart here is what's included in the packet we received tonight, and it's dated December 19th. But I went in and was looking at the packet earlier this week, and I printed out the same table, but it has different numbers.
Yeah.
So the student numbers are the same, but when you get to the FTE, I mean, there's huge variations in the numbers.
I don't know if they were huge, but what that was.
1016 here, and then we've got 961 on the packet as it was printed out earlier this week.
Yeah, so the first printing was us running everything by the principals. We printed it to run it by each one of the principals. So we had met with the principals last week, got their input, put that information into our database, ran it out, said, is this the way that it's really running? They said, there's some exceptions. So we cleaned it up.
And so we should rely on.
You should definitely rely on today's packet. This is the most recent. Obviously, we had to get a packet out, and so we went with the draft that we had on, I believe, Friday, which, as John has said a couple times, I mean, we had conversations as late as yesterday with the principals on some of these. So, today you have a completely updated packet. All of the conclusions and so on that you will see at the end were not even there at the time that packet was uploaded. So it was specified to be a draft.
So do you see that any other changes might be made after today's date?
I think that something we all need to bear in the back of our mind is that the data that we're using for this report is the October 1st data. That you've already had movement. You have a fluid operation. You have kids coming in and out of the system. You have reassignments. We've had a classroom change in the one school. They are going to vary slightly. At some point, we'll go back and we'll reconcile everything toward the end of the study. I don't see that it's going to move much.
Ms. Uri and then Ms. Morioni.
Thanks. So I just wanted to clarify to see if I understand what you're saying. So we began, and you said that our middle school capacity was pretty much on par for the course for middle school. But then we see that there's a pretty big difference between the 40% and the 62%, and 40% isn't really what you're looking for. Yeah. And 50.5, that's okay, but what's optimum in your opinion? Like, where do we want to be?
I think you want to run between 50 and 60%. Mm-hmm. That if you're under 50, you're too low. Running over 60 is really unusual, and it's because of the nature of the house structure.
Mm-hmm. But can I just underscore that is because of the design? So the building has the potential to run at a higher percentage, but not under
if you load it,
not under that house design. Right.
Yeah, if you load it, if you had, let's say you had this. This deal you made with your neighboring school district where, hey, we're running short on some kids at Moore this year. Can you send some over? Yeah, you could fill it up. That isn't going to happen. It's running low because of the students that are going into it, not because of the way that the school functions.
Oh, so it's not the house design.
The house design, you have limitations on the house design where you don't want to run too high because you could bust. Just like I was talking about the 4 groups of 25. What happens if you get 120 come in 1 year per house? Now you're running above your target. Mm-hmm. So there's a limitation that's placed because you're trying to run these 4 sections in one house. You don't want to run too far below it or too far above it. But I would say most of the middle schools that we've worked on, they almost always have 2 houses per grade level, and it's a 4-room house. Pretty common.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Before going over to Ms. Morioni, I wanted to do a time check. It's 7:30 currently, and so what I'd recommend, I already called on Ms. Morioni. I'll let you do your question, but for others, if you could write it down, and we'll get through the rest of the presentation and then address other questions. I want to make sure we at least get through the presentation itself. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, Ms. Morioni?
Thank you. I think I already know the answer to this, but this is just a snapshot in time with numbers on a certain date in October.
That's exactly right.
So when we start talking about sounds to be already people percolating ideas around what is the solution. I don't think we're even close to being there yet, because if we were to even talk about boundary changes, I personally would like to see a year, like 5-year study around, like that's where Davis demographics and their enrollment figures come in. Because the other thing that happens with these schools is King is an expeditionary school, so we have students that choose that school that
Exactly.
that fluctuates year by year as to how many schools are choosing, King versus one of our other more traditional middle schools as well. So in my mind, I'm not putting a lot of faith on it. I mean, I apologize for this, but I just see this is my 11th year on the school board, and having seen the difference of enrollment data year by year, I'd rather see more of a long-term approach to looking at our enrollment, aligning it with the capacity for the school. So I just wanted to get your reaction to that idea.
My reaction is I couldn't agree more. And not that I want to get into too much what's going to be discussed in the next meeting, but I think it's important to note that you're going to get a graph for each school, and the graph is going to show the enrollment on the y-axis, and it's going to show the year on the x-axis. And Davis is going to plot the enrollment. It's not static; it goes up and down. They're going to plot the yearly forecast enrollment on that chart, and we're going to put a horizontal line that runs across that chart, which shows what the maximum capacity is, and then we'll put another horizontal line below that to show you what range you ought to be running in. And you're right. I think any of you, I don't know I'm a real newcomer to your community, but in the data, there's some dramatic things that happen with ups and downs. So you have to leave yourself some room. You have to have a margin. You're not going to thread the needle. So like I said, I couldn't agree more. Okay.
Continue. So
this chart, this is like the biggie. This is where a lot of the alternative reorganizations are going to be. We're going to start working from this sheet. Let's go into the high schools, and I promise you that the high school portion of the presentation will not be anywhere near as painful as the middle school, because we're really, when we get into the high school, now we're talking about, I heard that, Javier.
I'm looking at you. I'm not sure that it's not going to be painful for her.
Painful to understand, I should say. So when you're talking about the high school, now you're moving into this subject-centered organization where you, for the most part, you have the ability to take your kids and redirect them throughout the school. There's a little bit of an impediment with the way that you have your day structured, where since you're not running a collegiate form of scheduling, i.e. you have, for the most part, one teacher per room. If you were in the collegiate setting, you could have teachers trading rooms, and I've seen this done with the more tenured teachers get their own room, and then in some schools they have a group, a department center where the teachers can go, and when their room is available, a less tenured teacher gets dibs or gets assigned to that room. You're doing that a little bit, but you're not doing that by design. So we're going to assume, until we get further direction on this one, that you're going to stay with the one teacher per room concept for the most part, and noting that there could be a few exceptions. So in Casco Bay, they're kind of a hybrid, and I think you guys know that. They're a hybrid. They have a little bit of house in what they're doing, and then they have an awful lot of subject centering. Casco Bay benefits from having a a large amount of students put into the school. The other two high schools, they are kind of starving for enrollment. So you can see that all of these departments are running fairly high. And again, these are the subjects, how each subject is loaded. So I'm okay with Casco Bay. And here's the floor plan. And again, this is a little unique, probably easier to see up on the second floor. The way they're organized, they have different groupings that they employ, and you can see, quite a bit of different departments because we've included the paths groups as well. But this doesn't look like a normal high school. It's not. It's a very special school with a very special program. So, are all of you familiar with how Casco Bay is laid out with the with the program, with the EL program? Everybody gets that?
Probably to varying degrees, but that's less of an issue, I think, today. So.
Yeah, I think the main point that I would make about Casco Bay is it has a program that is appealing to approximately 400 students, and it's got a capacity of about 400. So and in some cases he probably pushes some things a little too hard over there, and they're a little overutilized. But given the way that he breaks out his students and shares them in different spaces, he can get away with it. I don't see that happening in a traditional high school setting. Let's move on to Deering. So Deering, you can see that the numbers in some cases drop down a little bit. I would note that there's an anomaly here with the music department because they do take kids into Deering from the other for the band and the chorus. And my understanding is they do that after hours, so it doesn't actually show up in the schedule analysis because we're not looking at after hours scheduling. So here are your breakdowns. You've got a 63% in your scheduled periods. An interesting facet of Deering is the inclusion of the multilingual, the ELL. That there's you can see that that's a sizable portion there with that kind of capacity, 486 and 594. One, you would expect these to run low because it's a very specialized instruction, and the ELL is running actually higher than I thought it would be. So here you have your standard layout. This is in departments. And again, when you look at reconfigurations, you have to make sure that your departments are adequately sized. It's not just a matter of making sure that the school's adequately sized. Each department then has to be adequately sized. And if you have special purpose rooms that are specifically designed and equipped to hold a certain corner of the curriculum, you have to make sure that you keep that in there as well. But I would say this is a traditional high school. And traditional high schools, I see that they ought to be running up around 90%, which is 80% overall, because I've already spotted you 10% in my adjusted FTE. This is the, I guess this must have been the addition. Back to the traditional shape of the school. By the way, beautiful schools. Sometimes when I get into the older communities, I experience this on Long Island a lot. Long Island's a referendum state, and they have a really hard time addressing their space needs. They can get referendum bonds passed pretty easily. They just can't seem to get a space bond passed. And when they do, they only get a fraction of what they really should have done. So you find that the schools there, they become kind of a circuitous layout. It doesn't make sense. Your schools, for the most part, are shaped as they were originally conceived, which I think is it's a plus. It should make it easier to deal with the reconfiguration. Other part of the addition, kind of free-form open space. Upper level, strong departmentalization there. Same thing going on here. And then Portland High School. So you guys have seen you've seen a flip from Portland having more enrollment than Deering, and now it's the other way around. I'm not sure how long it took to make that transformation. But Portland is your larger school, and just I'd say very anecdotally, the larger the school at the high school level, the higher you would expect the utilization rate to be, because you have the ability to divide by more sections. It's really as simple as that. If you can divide by more sections, you have more sections in a building, you get incoming enrollment that's high. Let's say you have the ability to do 20 sections of English versus 10. You get the bumper crop of kids coming through. Dividing by 20 makes it a lot easier to maintain a class size than dividing by 10. So I think that the 42%, and that's 42% in the scheduled areas. I'll show you on the final chart what that looks like overall. But that's really very low. And again, it's nothing against Sheila's scheduling prowess, because I was very impressed with her ability to run the schedule. There's just not enough kids coming into it. Quick walkthrough of Portland High School. See the departmentalization. I was kind of curious as to how functional these spaces were over here. And it looks like it looks to me like some of the walls have moved from their original positions. What they used to call these buildings cells and bells, that you would divide them up into these even little pieces, and every classroom was the same size. Well, you've changed that around. Of course, we do have district-wide program running in here as well. But I was concerned that some of those classrooms coming down this side over here on each one of the floors, that they were getting a little tight. Some of them are a little tight. This is more like what you would expect the shape of those rooms to be from the original concept. How many years ago? 100? Okay, now we're going to come to this chart. I'm coming down the home stretch, folks. Thanks for bearing with me. So this one here. Let's pay attention to column D for a second. So column D Casco Bay, this is the gross percent utilized. So this is taking the FTE and the enrollment and marrying it right up with it, and those numbers are higher. Why are they higher? Because this is the one-shot deal. This is just taking, assuming that you had every kid come into the school first thing in the morning, and 774 of them took their seat at Portland High School for one period. We're not thinking about how they're moving around. We're just putting them in there statically for one period, and assuming that they are going into a scheduled period all day long. Of course, you could see that they're not. So overall, you would be running it at 61%. I think you'd be grossly misleading yourself if you just went by columns A, B, C, and D. You need to look a little bit deeper. So when we look over into column H, and we look at the number of classes that are being scheduled there. So we don't schedule lunch. We don't want to count lunch as a great academic scheduling period. We take that out of there, so it's going to drop it down. And it shows you that that you're running at 46% for Portland. That's really low. Again, it's really a function of how many kids that you're sending into it. You see Casco on his gross, he's actually over 100%. And when you extract the non-scheduled periods, and again, you have to have those. You're going to operate a school. You have to have some non-scheduled space and time. So that drops it down to 68. Then you have Deering at 63%. Overall, you're at 55.35. If somebody said, "Hey, let's rebalance. Let's take away the right to choose for high schools, and let's draw a line that sends so many kids to Portland, so many kids to Deering." You're still 55% on your scheduled periods, and 76 in D on your best day, with assuming that you had this great loading with your gross capacity analysis. You're at 76. That's really low. So you've got an abundance of space or a shortage of kids, depending on how you look at it, at the high school level as well. Let me go into some observations now. Run through these quickly. This is the page where I'm attempting to demonstrate to you that the capacity issues at the middle schools are really just a function of the enrollment, and that the core configuration is where you're earning all your points. So in the first table, I did this table first, and I took the actual enrollment, put it in this column. I counted the actual student periods per day from the detailed sheets that we showed you the summary sheet of the detailed sheets, but that's where this is coming from. And then in this column here, it's simply column B, the second column, divided by column A. And it shows you that you have at more 7.45 average student periods per pupil per day. And that changes as you go down. And it's proportional to the loading. So let's drop down to this column. This table, I did this second. Again, I have the actual enrollment in the first column. In the second column, I have the average section size with 3 grade levels and 8 full-time core sections per grade level. So I'm taking the 3 times the 8. I have 3 grade levels, 8 sections per grade level, I divide column A by 24, and I get these average section sizes. These were, I think, what we would be thinking if you were, let me go back to your student reps question. If we were looking at getting a higher capacity, we'd be looking at these being around 25, between 22 and 25. Here's my 22.5, which is 25 times 0.9. And then in the next column is simply the second column divided by the third column, and it gives you the average percent utilized in the full-time core sections. So I'm saying, let's forget about everything else that's going on in the school. Let's forget about the related arts. Let's just look at the core sections, because if you remember back to the summary chart, that's where we had the really high numbers, the ones that were up in the thousands. If we just look at that, we're determining our percentage of utilizations just by measuring what's going on in the core. And proof of that is over in this next chart, which was, I'm simply taking these same percentages here. For some reason, I gave you an extra decimal point. And then I have in the next column the overall percentage utilization, again from the summary tables that I showed you earlier. And then I came up with the ratio of the core subjects to the overall utilization rate. And you can see that that ratio kind of predicts that that if you're filling up your core sections, you've got a better ratio, got a higher ratio. And then the fourth table, this was the last one I did, was to simply extract, just for illustration purposes, the core students per periods, core student periods per day in this column, and what would be left in the non-core. So you can see there's a heavy weight on the core participation. So to me, that explains, once again, if you're looking at making the middle schools run at a higher percentage, load the cores. So some other takeaways. The percentage of utilization for the middle schools, they're consistent with other schools that we've looked at over the last 25 years. I would say more on the whole than individually. And I think we understand that the individual percentages of utilization are really being driven by the enrollment at each school. So if you had some way of moving the boundaries around and you wanted to have this this perfect balance among the three schools, you could do that. It might last you 1 or 2 years and you'd be doing it again. And you're at the low end, you're at 50% overall. You might be able to push that up to 60, but you're not going to go much higher. So not a lot of room for improvement at the middle school, the way I see it. And again, I noted my experience with the middle schools in name only that are really junior highs. Those will run at 70%. You don't have that. You've got real middle schools. Item 3, the impact of the smaller group delivery sections, supported study and advisory. Again, some of these classes run at, you're very deliberate about this, running them at a lower utilization rate. These, as I say here, it's a central tenet of the middle school concept. So if you're looking at recovering a couple points on your utilization rate by changing your program, yeah, you could do that, but it's not going to really be a middle school anymore. And then item 4, most of the you have to bake this into the analysis. Most of the classrooms at the middle schools are assigned to a single teacher, and actually the same thing's happening at the high school as well, because it can. Therefore, you do have a teacher availability function that provides some regulation of your overall efficiency as well. And item 5, something happened to my tabs there. So I noted that Moore takes a unique approach to its related arts delivery, that he has a number of elective courses that he's offering there, and that you would think that the diversity that in the curriculum that comes by way of those electives would have a slightly negative impact, because you're going to have, let's say you've got a lot of kids that are interested in photography, but no kids are interested in, well, there was a drama class. Nobody's interested in that. I don't know if that's the case or not. To me, it's a 50-50 deal, because the way you have it scheduled, they have to select some of the electives. Some of them are going to be heavily populated, other ones are going to be less. Overall, though, it works itself out. So I don't think that it's it's something that penalizes Moore's overall utilization rate. So now into the high school. I got just about a minute to go here. As I said before, as we were going through Casco Bay, they're running higher than we expected, mainly because they have some of that student centering going on versus pure subject centering. The two large high schools, Deering at 1121, Portland at 1261, were designed and expanded to hold substantially more kids. And I note this because when you've had schools in a community as long as those, they've been around forever. Everyone who is alive in Portland, who's been here their whole life, they remember those schools, and they remember them being fuller. That, oh, we've had so many more kids in these schools. Why can't we do that now? And I'm sure you guys have broached this topic many times over the years. When that school was originally designed, it was before we had federal legislation that brought special education programs into the schools. It was just a different world. It's an apples and oranges comparison. But if you wanted to look at, just for the sake of comparison, how much would your capacity increase if you didn't have to deal with special ed the way that you do? And it would be Portland would increase by 14%, and Deering would increase by 19%. Those are pretty big chunks if you think about it. So when the old timers who graduated from those two schools many years ago say, I remember when there were so many more kids in there. Yeah, it was a different set of rules, and all that space is still there, but we really can't use it the way you used it decades ago. Casco Bay has the highest average section at 15.13, Deering at 12.33, Portland at 11.66. That's not so much because of your program, because you just don't have enough kids going in. With the exception of Casco Bay, your high schools are greatly underutilized. And as I said before, as a point of reference, we would like to see them running close to 90. And that's not having a spare 10%. It's having a spare 20%, because I'm factoring these for inefficiency with my adjusted FTE. So that's all I have on your secondary, and I'll take any questions.
It's now 8 o'clock. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. It was an excellent presentation. It's now 8 o'clock, and what I'd like to suggest, since one of our norms is to begin and end on time, that if I would welcome questions sent to me, which I can give to the superintendent, and we'll cover them at the beginning of the next meeting. And if that works for everyone, the superintendent will obviously share them with Mr. Thomas to make sure we have the benefit of his insights. But to avoid having our meeting go much later, I would suggest that we do it that way. And my email address is in the overall presentation. And
I think we're fine to stay here too, if anybody is, wanting to stay and ask specific questions of John, or myself for that matter, to do that. But I think in the spirit of sort of ending on time. So,
yeah. Does that work for everyone? Yes, Ms. Cook.
But one technical clarifying question, so that when I'm looking at the
Okay.
Good, Mrs. Cook.
The 90% we're looking for would be compared to letter H as opposed to letter D in those graphs.
That's correct.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Our next meeting is January 14th, and we will start with follow-up to this presentation, move to the enrollment projections, which are an important piece looking forward, and then start our discussions on various scenarios that we want to explore. So thank you for coming. And with that, the formal meeting is adjourned, and as the superintendent mentioned, a few of us will stick around for any other questions that you might have. I would still send the questions to me that you ask so that others will benefit from knowing what your questions were. Thank you.